And we're back on Fresh Waves. I'm your host, Bren Masson. We're talking with Sue Reynolds about writing. You are an author, and you had that desire since you were really young. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of people have never considered themselves to be writers, but after a summer of sitting outside, whether it's at the cottage or at home, and reading, because that's a really big summer pastime. I mean, the bookstores even market it as great summer reading. Now they might be thinking, I do have a story that I want to write. I want to become a novelist. How does it go from that thought of, that would be a cool story, to actually getting it on the paper?
Well, the first thing you have to do is what we call bum and chair, right? You actually have to put your ass on the chair cushion, get your pen in your hand and your notebook open or your keyboard open in front of you and commit to the writing. And so many people actually never even get that far, right? They think they want to write. Well, they know they want to write, but the idea of committing to it, putting it on the paper or on the screen where it could be read by somebody else is terrifying. I always say that who we are as writers or the way we are on the page is actually very much the way we are in real life. It's incredible to me how people's writing so often echoes their personality. The way they engage with the act of writing is very much the way they engage with life.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, Cheryl MacLaine was here, right?
Yes.
Cheryl is a no-holds-barred, go-for-the-guts writer. She's very, very brave on the page. And, as you know, you said you were in Costa Rica with her helping set up. She's that way in real life, too.
Right.
Yeah.
That is interesting because she is that way. Hey, Cheryl, I know you're listening this morning. Nice to have you listening from Costa Rica. Okay, so normally in everyday life, a person says, that dripping tap is driving me nuts. They get up, they walk across the room, they turn it off. When you're writing that down, there has to be a whole descriptive process in that doesn't take place in the normal talking it through in your head. Mm-hmm. It's the painting of the picture.
Right. So, you say, how does someone start? I mean, one of the things we do in writing workshops is we'll often offer a prompt, a way for somebody to get into the writing, right? And they don't actually even have to know where they want to go. I mean, they can start with a completely tabula rasa, completely open, or they can start with this idea, I want to have, I have these two characters in mind, a mother and daughter, and I want them to have a key fight, but they don't know how to get into it. So you just offered that tap, right? Sometimes a prompt I'll offer will be something that is very sensory based. So I might say, start with the sound of water dripping. And somebody will be writing about a little creek, a little freshet. Somebody will be writing about a tap that won't shut up. And they'll have the sound plink, plink, plink. And then before you know it, you've got the character's irritation, and then that irritation spills into her thinking about her mother, and then her mother comes in the room, and then suddenly they're in dialogue. But it's the sensory detail can be the way in, right? Mm-hmm. The way the sun feels on the top of your head. The sound of, leaves rustling, a sound of car tires, making that ripping sound on a wet road outside your window. I mean, you can start anywhere, but as soon as you begin to capture the sensations of the world, the way they show up in your mind, you're also communicating that to your reader. They've done, PET scans of people's brains when they are, for instance, looking at a red apple. And a certain part of their brain lights up. There's more activity there. Then they have them close their eyes and imagine the red apple. And the same part of their brain gets active and lights up.
Yeah.
Not to the same degree, but the same part of the brain. So the thing is, somebody who is imagining something sensory has the experience of that sensory thing, even if they're not, actually engaging with it. So as a writer, a big part of your job is to make the world light up in their brains in a way that they're right inside the sensory experience.
That's a really interesting thought, because that's exactly what happens when you read good writing.
Exactly.
There's other times when you're reading something that's really not catching my attention, or I'll be reading something that's just like, there's just an element missing, and it's a layered effect almost. There's the character development, which we could talk about for probably 4 hours, because every writer, I think, has to be a people watcher and a psychologist in many ways, because they have to be delving into the minds of the characters that they're creating. But they also have to be really good at painting the picture of where they are, what they're doing, how they're feeling, what's going on.
And there's a big difference. We were talking at the break about sort of the difference between anecdote and writing, right? Mm-hmm. So in anecdote, we tend to tell things a certain way. We tell them very much from our perspective, and that's a given in conversation. And the operative word is tell. We report, but we don't make it come alive the way we were just talking about on the page, mm-hmm. right? And if you tried to do that in conversation, it would just seem weird. But the thing is that when you report anecdotes on the page, that also just seems weird. It seems flat. There's a lot of authorial intrusion. Like, you can feel the author in there invested in the way you react to something. And that's really irritating as a reader, right? You want to encounter the world that the author has created, but you want to be able to make your own decisions about it. You want to experience it. And so when the mother, comes in and bangs her coffee cup down on the counter so hard that the coffee splashes out, you're just presented with that fact, right? As a reader, you're reading it and you're thinking, oh, she's really irritated. But there's nothing actually more, what's the word? Divisive, more separating, more arm's length than having the author say she was really irritated. You're like, don't tell me how she's feeling. Let me see what she's doing. Let me hear how she's talking to her daughter, and I'll figure out how irritated she is.
Mm-hmm. It's like a person in real life coming up to you and saying, I'm really irritated.
Yeah.
You probably didn't need to say that because your facial expression just says it all.
Exactly. What do they say? That something like 85% of our conversation is not transmitted verbally. It's through our facial expression, the tone of our voice, our body language, the way we stand or sit or lean. And as a writer, you have to recreate that on the page without swamping your reader in details. So you have to give just enough that they can pick up the cues, the subtext we call it, right? And understand what's going on without having the author interfere and tell you, this is how you should feel about what's going on. This is how this person is feeling. This is how this person is feeling. This is what's going on between them emotionally. There's nothing that'll kill a story faster than being told how to feel about something.
That's interesting, because I've never noticed that before, but now that you say it, that's true. You want to have your own take on it. I think that's why, if you read a book and then see the movie, first of all, the movie's usually way shorter than the book. It's like the Reader's Digest condensed version, which, is never the best interpretation of anything. No offense to Reader's Digest condensed book lovers, but it really isn't. If you're liking that condensed version, read the whole book.
Right.
And in the movies, I'll often say to my kids, because they're watching a movie that I've already read the book of, I'll say, it's a little different in the book.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Mom, books are always different. Yeah, that's true. But in the book, even though the character is described, I have my own vision of what they look like.
Right.
And even though the setting is described, I have my own vision of what that castle looks like, or what that playground looks like. Quidditch in my mind was so different than Quidditch. And the only reason I'm using the Harry Potter books is because they're so widely read that most people have read the books or seen the movie. But the game was wonderfully created in the movie, but not the way I had it in my mind, I can honestly say.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing too. Once you're presented with the concrete version of it in movies, you're given the sight, sounds. Mm-hmm. For me anyway, I can never unlearn that, right? Like, now Harry Potter is that movie actor.
Yes.
Ron is the movie actor, Hermione.
Yeah.
And yet I know that they looked very different in my mind the first time I read the books.
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also, I don't know, do you have this? There's a kind of magical feeling that happens in my chest when I'm reading a really good book and the world is alive and I'm engaging with, I don't even know how else to describe it. It's this evanescent engagement with the story. It's somehow all mine, even though, whoever reads the book, I mean, it's also all theirs, right? But it's my version of it in my body, in my mind. And that leaches away somehow when a book is made into a movie, for me. I mean, I can never get it back.
And it's funny that you said in your chest, because that's where I feel it too. In my chest and in my core. It's just this world that somehow is all mine. Mm-hmm. And even though someone else has already read the book, my thrill, I get a kick out of somebody who has the same interpretation as I do. Mm-hmm. Because someone else can read it and have a totally different take on it. But when someone has to say, it's like, really? Yeah, you got that too? Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
It's really kind of a neat thing. Especially if the book gives you the space to grow it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? There are some books that are written where everybody who read it will probably have exactly the same impression of what went on and how it was all presented. But there are other books that really give you space to be and create your own little world out of it. Mm-hmm. Neil Gaiman's good at that, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. His dark underworld. I think we could sit down a room of 50 people and everybody would have a different impression of what the characters really look like in their own minds and what the space looks like in the world that he creates. That's a gift too in its own way. But there's a lot of people who don't like that. A lot of people who don't like the vastness of it and would rather have it more condensed so that they can understand it more simply.
Yeah. Margaret Atwood has this book about writing called Negotiating with the Dead. And yeah, genius. And she has this wonderful, she talks for a while about how an author has a contract with the work, right? And people think that the author has a contract with the reader. She says that's not true. The author has a contract with the work. The reader has a contract with the work. And those two things are separate tracks. The third leg of the triangle isn't ever met, right? So
interesting.
So the author writes the world the way they imagine it. The reader experiences the world they imagine it. Of course, they're going to engage with the story based on everything they know about the world, the way they've experienced their life, and of course that's why you were talking about people having the same experience of the book, but I often also find that people have very different experiences of the book.
For sure.
It's one of the big disappointments when you read a book and you absolutely adore it and you're focused on certain things and you share it with a friend and they say, no, I don't know. It didn't really do it for me.
Cheryl and I are like that on a lot of books that we like, or I'll say there's some that we both adore, some authors that we both adore, and I'll say, oh yeah, one of my favorite books was Blanche. It didn't really cut it for me.
Yeah, that wasn't my favorite. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's good because you come from different life experiences, so different books affect different people in different ways.
Yeah, of course, for sure.
To me, it's always amazing how a book can affect so many people when these certain books, like remember the Celestine Prophecy, how it exploded into this massive worldwide thing. It's like the Da Vinci Code. And it's a phenomenon, I think, that a book can really affect so many people and so profoundly. Mm-hmm. Where people are racing out to get the next one or racing out to get the one before, which actually should have come before the one. Right. You know how that all works.
Right.
It's a really interesting thing. So there's got to be something within that book that really appeals to the masses.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because those two books, and I'm just thinking of three sort of phenomenon books. One was the Da Vinci Code, one was the Celestine Prophecies, and one was 50 Shades of Grey, right?
Yes.
And interestingly, as a reader, as a writer, I've found all three books to be not particularly well written.
No.
But there is something about the story that is really engaging for a wide range of people. So I'm not quite sure what that tells us in terms of writing Except again, I guess you were talking about how does somebody get started. So if you have an idea for a story, that's a very profound place to start, because a good story can carry
bad writing.
Mediocre to bad writing. Exactly.
Well, I have a friend who's an English teacher, and we were at a backyard barbecue. People were talking about the books that they've read, and someone stood up, and out from underneath the couch, like between the cushions of the couch, fell 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh, no.
And the woman whose house she was so funny. Okay, I'm reading it. I have to admit it. I tried to stuff it underneath the cushions when you guys came in. And it was so funny because she said it was the worst written piece of literature, if you could even call it that she's ever read. But because so many people had read it and loved it and kept talking about it, she felt like she had nothing to contribute to the conversations because she'd never read it. So she decided to read it. And I said, I've never read it either. And the English teacher said to me, don't bother. Seriously? Don't bother. Mm-hmm. So I watched the Netflix film and thought, it's interesting. It is a good story. It's an odd story. But again, because the video so broadly covered it and condensed it down, I think I'd have to read the book to figure out what was the big phenomenon in the first place. But I've just never been that interested. Yeah. We can talk about the 50 Shades phenomenon. I think it was a whole, as books often are when they're wildly successful, it's a whole host of factors coming together at once. I think it was because it was right around the time that e-readers became really available. Right. So people could read erotica on the subway, in public places without people knowing. I think a lot of people had never had any exposure to written erotica. I'm going to make a crazy broad generalization here and say that I think in terms of sexuality, that women are probably more interested in relationship and story. With apologies to Jay, it's guys who are supporting the porn industry, which is a very thin storyline, right? and women that are supporting the erotica industry, which is, really broadly based on story. The sex is there, it's exciting, but it's, it's only a small part. It sort of keeps raising its ugly head in the story. Anyway, I feel like we're wandering way off topic here again. But that's okay. It's it'd be interesting to see if these authors, obviously Dan Brown was an author from the very beginning, but some of these books that create these phenomenons are a one-off.
Right.
And you've never heard of the author before. You can't find any of their works before because there wasn't any. And you can't find any after because whatever they wrote after really didn't go anywhere. And I think that's what happened with the Celestine Prophecy afterwards, is that the books just kind of meh. The sensationalistic one was the first one. And so I don't think you need to be afraid of writing that one great novel.
Right.
When they say that people say they have one great novel, every author has one great novel. For some, it actually is the same novel just reproduced 50 different times. And for others, it's that one great book. So you don't have to think down the future that you're going to be an Enid Blyton and write, thousands of books over your lifetime. You can be the author of just that one novel that's yours. Right.
And it does start with that story idea. I mean, the really strong thing about the Celestine Prophecy was the idea behind it, right?
Yes.
It certainly wasn't the writing. The really strong piece of the Da Vinci Code was the idea.
Yeah.
So if you have an idea for a novel that's come to you, while you're driving, or I get all my ideas in the shower, while you were sitting on the dock at the cottage, having that cup of coffee, the next thing to do is to commit to it. Say, I'm intrigued. You don't want to say, I believe in this idea. It's the greatest thing that's ever happened. But the thing that will get you to the page and keep you faithful is, I'm intrigued by this idea. I want to play with it. I want to see where it goes. I want to see what it can become without getting really invested in, I'm going to be the next Dan Brown or the next Stephen King or the next, I can't even remember the 50 Shades author's name.
No,
my apologies.
Okay. But that, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can just write, the story doesn't have to be for the world. It can just be for you.
Well, that's the thing, right? To start with, writing is just a delicious thing to do. To be investigating your own ideas. Writing has its own power. If you can get your butt in the chair, get your pen on the paper, and begin to surrender to the writing, it will take you places that you would be best not to steer yourself. Like, you don't want to grab hold and take the steering wheel and control the idea. It is a contract, as Margaret Atwood says, right? You have this idea, you begin to explore it on the page, and I can't tell you how often in workshops people will finish a writing, a timed writing, and they'll look up, you know, they're coming back from a long way away. You can see it in their faces and their eyes, and they laugh and they say, "Oh my God, I have no idea where this came from." Or, you know, "Oh, this went someplace I wasn't expecting at all." But it's delicious. It's delightful, that engagement and the synthesis that happens between, you know, you and the page. You're not steering it. You're discovering. And there's so much power and fun in that.
Yeah.
And that's long before you start layering it with, you know, I want to publish, I want to get it out there, I want to be a best-selling author. Like, just to play with that, just to engage with that deliciousness is the first gift you can give yourself as a writer.
That's a really great way of looking at it, because then it is just for you.
Yeah, and sure, it may it may develop legs. It may go all the way. It may be traditionally published, and you may become a best-selling author. That's all possible.
Right.
But the thing is, if you put that weight on your writing just as you're beginning, then, you know, you're crushed before you ever start out. And it's like me, you know, way back when I had my baby, and every hour I could eke out with my story had damn well better be productive and better be as good as the first one and better be, you know, and I just froze. That's the beginning of writer's block.
Oh yeah.
is when you start layering your work with expectations right from the very beginning. And
expectations that are almost just setting yourself up for failure.
So heavy.
Yeah.
So heavy. I mean, you know, I have a lot of people who I facilitate in workshops who get stuck, right? And inevitably, when they're telling me they're blocked, they can't write, and we start paring it down, it all gets down to they're freighting their writing with too much expectation.
Right.
It's all about product, and it's not about process.
Right.
As long as you can stay deliciously with the process in the first draft.
Yeah, the shitty first draft, and expect it to be just that, the shitty first draft.
That's right. That you can make your way forward, but if you start layering the expectations on the first draft, you get crushed by those expectations. The place for product is the second draft, when you've got that loose, rambling, delicious, fun first draft all completed, and then you say, okay, I really like this. I really believe in it. I want to take it farther. I want to polish it up. You know, I want to shape it. I want to create something that I could send to an agent or a publisher. But that's second draft work, right? As when somebody gets stuck, it's almost inevitably because they're trying to do second draft work.
First time round.
In the first draft. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So when somebody's got that story, I've always heard, well, there's a process. So you're going to write, then you have to sit down, you have to have your beginning, your middle, and your end, and you write those three first, and then you fill in the gaps. And I think to myself, that would just kill it for me right there. I wouldn't write a word, because I often don't have the ending.
Yeah.
And I was reading a novel that I really enjoyed, and at the end I read the author's notes, and he said, this story had no ending when I began.
Mm-hmm.
It was a thought. What happens if you miss the train? And I thought, wow, that is just fantastic. That's what I got from the book. I never got a formula when it started. Just the fact that the story started and it organically moved from missing the train and taking that next train that he'd never been on before. I just think, wow, that just opens the door to a myriad of possibilities.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's staying with that delicious discovery, right? If you ask what if questions and then you sit down with your writing and you discover what if as you're writing it. Writers are divided into what we call plotters and pantsers. Plotters are people who, you know, do a very full outline before they ever start and then write to the outline. And there can be discovery in small ways, but you're not going to get a big discovery over the story usually because you've kind of got that worked out. And actually, some plotters will do a kind of pantsing, which is what we call writing by the seat of your pants.
Right.
As they're creating the story outline. Mm-hmm. So that's a kind of loose in between thing. Pantsers are people like your friend that you were just talking about. What happens if I miss the train, or if someone misses the train? And then you sit down and you discover what happens. And the challenge around that is that you have to be willing to write a lot, because, if you want to write a book in 90 days, and there's, lots of books out there, write your novel in 90 days, you pretty much have to stick with a plotting schedule, because you have to know where you're beginning, where you're going to go, where you're going to end up. But I will say that often books that are written with that kind of plotting basis they feel more predictable. They feel, I can't remember whose quote it is. It says, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader." Like, if you know where it's going right from the very beginning, the reader often knows where it's going right from the very beginning. And then you get into the whole formulaic thing. Romance novels, where by page 50, this has to have happened, and by page 100, this has to have happened. It's also that Hollywood screenwriter model, right? Yeah. I mean, how many Hollywood movies have you seen where exactly, you think, okay, we're here, we're at 75 minutes into the movie, this is where it's all going too well, something's going to crash immediately. And often from what's come before, you can even predict what's going to go wrong, right? Whereas, for instance, you watch some English films, some European films, and you never know from 1 minute to the next what's going to happen, but it's delightful.
Absolutely delightful. The first thing that comes to my mind when you said that was The Gods Must Be Crazy. What a great movie, from start to finish. And it was just so unscripted. It was just amazing. Anyway, we're going to take a little break. When we come back for the second hour, we're going to be talking more about therapeutic writing. This is the writing that you never want to have published. It's the writing that's just for you. It's the writing that helps you express yourself. It's the writing that allows you to say the things that you may not feel safe speaking about in the world around you. But if you allow yourself, you can put it on the page in a special notebook in a special place that's just for you and you alone. Share only if you want. So that's what we'll be talking about in the second hour. We're going to be listening to a song by a young Canadian artist, and his name is Robin. But this is his song, Again and Again. Jay, we'll play as much as we can up to the top of the hour. You're listening to Fresh Waves on Whistle FM. Stay tuned for hour number 2 with Sue Reynolds.